Hello and welcome to Rooted and Unwithered. I'm Cole Newton, and the following is a continuation of our series called Ex Libris Ad Cor, in which we are talking about books and reading in general and taking them from the bookshelf and hopefully applying them to the heart. And so before we dive into this week's topic, in which I'll be following up our conversation from last week about the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, I have a guest with me that was not with me last week, but she has returned. And so, Eowyn, are you here with us?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, so...
I finally got here because I was all busy last week.
And so you have been recommending books for us, right?
Yes, really good books in general, like really, really good books. They're like children's books. I mean, not all the books that I recommend are children's books, but very, very good books, and I recommend that other children should read them because they're great for me. Like, they're the best books I've ever read in my life.
Okay.
Including many different books, because in this whole shelf, I love all the books.
We are in our home library at the moment, and so...
Very glad you have me here for the podcast again.
And so what book do you have for us this week?
The Last Battle of Narnia.
Oh, okay. So
we've
already talked about a couple of books from Narnia, right?
And it is the best book I've ever read in my life.
Okay.
It is so good. I recommend children would have to read.
So why do you like it so much?
I don't know. I just like it.
It's just a really fun story.
Yeah.
Now, but when we first started to listen to it, because we listened to the audio, right?
Yes.
You didn't want to finish it, right? Why was that?
It was a little bit scary. I was like, "Ooh, this is the scariest thing ever." And then when I finished it, I was like, "Oh, this is the best book I've read in my ever life."
Oh, okay. And the first like half of the book it does have some scary parts, doesn't it?
Very scary parts.
Yeah. Do you have a recommendation for maybe what if there is a kid listening to this that doesn't want to read The Last Battle because the first part of it is really scary? What would you tell them?
I would tell them probably they would get scared. I say probably they would get scared in the first half, but if they they have to keep reading on to get the good part.
And does it so it's not scary all the way through, and it has a happy ending?
Yes.
A really happy ending?
Yes.
Okay. So The Last Battle, which is the last of the Narnia books, right?
Book 7.
Book 7. Okay.
It was almost 10 books.
So that's your recommendation for us this week. Okay, Eowyn. Well, thank you so much for being on and for bringing us a book. Can we talk to you again next week?
Yes.
All right. Thank you. Till then.
Bye.
Last week, we began to discuss about the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament. And so this week will be a little bit of a follow-up to that. So I said last week that there was a passage, a part of Exodus chapter 24, as I've been doing my readings through the Greek version of Exodus that stuck out to me, but we didn't have time to discuss the Septuagint as a whole and to dive into that. And so just to recap what we said about the Septuagint last week. So the Septuagint is a translation of the Hebrew, right? So we give the Hebrew precedence in what it says, right, when we're translating the scriptures. I think that is properly what we should do, right? But as Peter Gentry says, the Septuagint is essentially the first translation, the first commentary on the Hebrew Old Testament. And so it is really valuable in that sense, right? In giving us an idea for how the Jews around the time of Christ and a little bit before the time of Christ were understanding the Hebrew scriptures, how they were looking at the Bible, and because translation necessitates interpretation, right? In order to translate into something from one language into another language, you are going to have to interpret that, right? You're going to have to make a decision on what you think that it is saying, right, as you bring it into another language. And so, because that is a necessity of the translating process, the decisions that the translators made in translating the Hebrew Old Testament into Greek gives us an insight into what that they believed the Old Testament was saying in Hebrew, right? And so one instance this week that I thought was pretty good incident of how this can be helpful is on my YouTube feed, a video popped up of Michael Heiser, which I'm not terribly familiar with his work, but I know that he's a really big fan of this of speaking about the spiritual dimensions of things, right, and all those kinds of things. So I don't know a ton about his work. I don't recommend anything of him, nor go against any of his stuff, right? I'm not very familiar, but I listened to a quick video of his where he was talking about. Are we translating Genesis 1:1 correctly? And he was making the case that in Hebrew, a very valid translation of Genesis 1:1 would be not in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, but when God began to create the heavens and the earth. And he notes that the Jewish Publication Society, JPS, that's actually how they translate Genesis 1:1, right? And one of the thought processes I had after reading that, after watching that video is, well, yes, that may be a valid translation of the Hebrew, right? But one thing that I think needs to be factored in is the fact that in the Septuagint, Genesis 1:1 was translated into Greek saying, enarche epoiesin hatheos, right? That in the beginning, God created. God made the heavens and the earth, right? So I think that has to be some sort of big factor going into exactly how we should read the Hebrew how we should translate the Hebrew, right? Because obviously for the translators of the Septuagint, they did not read that as when God began to create the heavens and the earth, but instead the Greek shows that they were reading it as we typically translate Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, right? And of course, that has implications for the New Testament as well, because we get into John's gospel. And of course, John, beginning his gospel, he's deliberately invoking the wording of Genesis 1:1, because just as Genesis 1:1 begins with that in the beginning, en arche, John begins his gospel, en arche, ein halagos, right? In the beginning was the word, right? And that's actually a pretty good bridge into where we will be going today, because John's gospel is going to factor into this. So John's gospel, John chapter 1 verse 1, is one of the greatest verses of the New Testament. So the Greek there is actually pretty simple, syntax-wise, grammatical, but like everything in the Gospel of John, it's deep, very deep. Who can know it, right? It is very, very rich theologically, even if the grammar may not be the most complex of things, right? But so it's interesting that in learning Greek, and so I'm still very much a beginner in Greek, right? And so if any of this is off, somebody who knows Greek more, feel free to correct me, and I'll make any sorts of corrections that I need to, right? But one of the first portions of the Greek New Testament that you learn to read when you're learning Greek is John 1:1, right? It's pretty simple. And so as I've been working my way through the Greek translation of Exodus, through Exodus in the Septuagint, trying to read through that as just practice my Greek as I'm studying and preaching through the book of Exodus. In chapter 24, I noticed that there was a phrase that was used. In verse 2, it talks about, in chapter 24, Moses and Aaron's two oldest sons, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders, they are invited by God to come up onto the mountain, right? So God is going to ratify his covenant with Israel, and they are the representatives of Israel, right? So they're invited to come onto the mountain, and they're going to see God. They're going to eat with God upon the mountain, right? But in verse 2, even though they're being invited onto the mountain, when in chapter 19 of Exodus, all of the people of Israel are told to stay behind a barricade that Moses sets up, right? And then in chapter 20, the people don't even want to break through to that barrier. They want to stay as far away as possible, right? But so the people have to stay away. They are not allowed to touch the mountain. If they touch the mountain, they will die. But Moses and Aaron and his 2 sons and the 70 elders, they are invited to come up onto the mountain. But even then, even as that group of men, as representatives of Israel, they get told that they can come past the barrier and they can come onto the mountain. Verse 2 says that, but even still, only Moses gets to come near to the presence of God. Only he gets to come near to God. The other elders with him, they have to stay away. And it's interesting that in the Greek, when it says that Moses can come near, the phrase that it uses there is monos pros ton theons. Only Moses can be with God, or can approach God, can be in the presence of God, right? And so I was reading that and noticed that little phrase there at the end, pros ton theon, is the same wording that John 1:1 uses to say that in the beginning the Word was the Word, and the Word was with God, was in the presence of God, or was with God, right? So kai halagos ein pros ton theon, right? And so saw that connection and was like, well, I wonder if there's something to that. And so started looking around in the book of Exodus for when that phrase is used, for when being with God or in the presence of God is what pros can mean, or in many places to or towards God, for how that was used. And, so this is how you do the scientific experiments, right? The scientific method, right? You begin with a question. So is there something to this? Could John have potentially had echoes of the Greek Exodus in his mind as he was writing his gospel, right? And so I did a little bit of searching. Wanted to see how that phrase was used in the Septuagint of Exodus, and it turns out that the way that is used does seem to be pretty significant, right? So in chapter 4, which is a part of Moses receiving his speaking to God in the burning bush, receiving his original command from God, right? So one of the things that's interesting there is, Moses tells God that he's too afraid. God needs to send someone else. He says that he can't speak very well, right? And so God tells Moses that he will send Aaron for him, right? And so in Exodus chapter 4, verse 16, God says to Moses, "And he, Aaron, shall speak for you to the people, and he shall be your mouth, but you shall be to him in the things pertaining to God." And so what's interesting is that in how that's translated there, like "you shall be to him the things pertaining to God," is actually that same phrase. You will be to him pros ton theon, right? That phrase is used there again. That Moses will be like God to Aaron, right? And that God will send Aaron to be pros ton laon, that he will send him to the people, to be with the people, right? And so there's a couple other places where that's used in the plagues, where it talks about where God sends Moses to Pharaoh, and where Moses speaks to God. So when Pharaoh asks Moses to intercede for him, to pray to God for him. So the way that it uses that is it says that Moses goes pros ton theon, that Moses prays to God. He goes to God with those requests, right? So even in those first couple of incidences, right, we see that this is shaping up to where it's giving a flavor of Moses as a mediator, right? Is that Moses is the one who has a message from God to the people, right? That Moses is going to give that to Aaron, and Aaron's going to be the one that proclaims it to the people, and Moses is going to be the one who goes to God, right? We see a similar circumstance of that in chapter 18, where Moses is speaking to he meets with his father-in-law, Jethro, right? And Jethro tells him, he says that he sees Moses judging all of the people, right? He says that those things are going to be too difficult for him, right? That this is too great of a people for Moses to lead all by himself. And so he tells him to, in verse 19 of Exodus chapter 18, Jethro says this to Moses. He says, "Now then listen to me, and I will advise you, and God will be with you." And so interestingly, it uses the word there, meta, for with, so not pros, like we see like we've been seeing, right? And he says, "And I will advise you, and God will be with you. You be for the people the things pertaining to God, and you shall bring their cases to God," right? And so the phrasing that is used there, right? So we have this mediation where Moses is the one who's going to be to the people the things pertaining to God, right? And he will also bring their cases to God, right? And again, the phrasing that is used there, right, is proston theon, right? That he will bring to the he will bring to the people, he'll mediate between the people, between them and God, right? Then in chapter 19, interestingly, we see that phrase used not just of Moses, but we see it used of the people, but it's used negatively of the people, right? Where it's used, where God is, he tells Moses to make up a barrier there, right? And he tells Moses to make sure that he makes that barrier so that the people cannot break out towards God, right? So we see this in chapter 19, verse 24, where God says, "Then the Lord said to Moses, 'Go, descend, and you and Aaron with you come up, but do not let the priests and the people use force to come up to God,' proston theon, 'lest the Lord destroy some of them," right? So far you have Moses being the only one who has that special privilege to come near to God, to be with God, to be in the presence of God. And here in Exodus chapter 19, verse 24, when it's used, it is of the people, it's used negatively. Do not let them come, proston theon. Do not let them come into the presence of God. Don't let them be with God. And then, of course, in 24, the one that kind of jogged my mind for all of this, right? The elders get to come up to the mountain, but again, the emphasis is, but only Moses gets to be proston theon, gets to be with God. He gets to come near to God, right? And the word that it uses there for Moses only is monos, right? Where we get the prefix for words like monotheism, right? That we worship only one God, right? So Moses is the only one, right? He's monos proston theon. He's the only one that gets to go near to God, right? And then there's another usage of it later on, where Moses again is being emphasized as the mediator in the section chapters 32 through 34 about the golden calf, right? And so in surveying all of those things, right, it seems that the emphasis of that particular phrase in Exodus seems to be that Moses is, as we see there in chapter 24, the only one who gets that special privilege, right? Everyone else shrinks back, and this is of course what we read in the book of Exodus, where it makes that case specifically, right, that there was never another person like Moses who spoke to God face to face as a man speaks to his friend, right? And so it seems that phrase is a kind of verbal indication of that is Moses' special privilege, right? As this unique prophet, the one through whom the law comes, right? Moses alone gets to come into the presence of God because he is the mediator between God and his new covenant people, right? And that's awesome, right? And of course, that's what we see in the Bible, right? Where Moses is probably alongside Abraham and David and maybe Elijah, or is the supreme figure of the Old Testament, right? Now, what about John 1:1? So, John begins his gospel right by writing, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God," pros ton theon, and the Word was God, right? So my thought process with this is, I just wonder if John was used to hearing or reading the Septuagint translation of Exodus, right? And so maybe he is, maybe there's an aspect of this to where he is bringing that into his discussion of Jesus as he is writing and opening his gospel, right? And especially this would make sense of why he goes back and he emphasizes in verse 2 that he was in the beginning with God, right? Emphasizing this, that Moses had a unique relationship, right? Of all the people in Israel, he alone got to be the mediator between God and his people, right? And though he was a sinful man, though he was a murderer, right, killed the Egyptian, though he was sinful and would later, because of his sin, because he placed himself as on equal footing with God, he would be forbidden from entering the promised land, right? There's still no one like Moses until... and of course this is a prophecy that Moses himself made in Deuteronomy chapter 18, right, verse 18, I believe, where Moses says, "There will come one day a prophet like me, listen to him," right? So literally one of the prophecies of Jesus is that Jesus would be a prophet like Moses, right? And he is like Moses in the sense where he does have this unique relationship with God. He is in the presence of God. He is with God. But unlike Moses, Jesus wasn't invited into the presence of God. He wasn't invited to be in the place of this, to have this special role of mediation. Instead, from the beginning, at the time of the beginning, already the Word existed, right? So that means that he was older than the beginning, right? So once the beginning, even as the beginning had begun, the Word already existed, right? And even from the beginning, he was with God. He was already in the presence of God. He already was had a unique relationship face to face with God. And why is that? Well, it's because he was God. Because even though he is distinct from God, he also is divine himself, right? Jesus is not the same as the Father, and yet Jesus is God of God, light of light, very God of very God, as the Nicene Creed rightly affirms, right? Well, so what does all of this mean, right? So John is saying that we have this greater mediator who has come to us, right? That we don't just have Moses, right? This preeminent prophet that God has raised up, that he's brought out to meet with his people, right? But instead, what we have is we have one who is God and yet is distinct from God. And what has he done? So the great marvel of the second half of the book of Exodus is, and even Exodus chapter 3 and 4, right? God meeting with Moses at the burning bush, is that Moses gets to come into the presence of God. Moses gets to draw near into the thick darkness where God was. That's what Exodus 20 says, right? Moses gets to talk with God face to face as a friend. Well, the marvel of the Word, since he is God, right, it's not just that he was always with God, that he was always in the presence of God, right? That is a marvel, right? That's a splendid, wondrous thing to think about. But where's John leading to? So if the marvel of Jesus isn't really that he's been invited into the presence of God, because he's always been in the presence of God, because he is God. Well, so then what's the marvelous thing about Jesus as our mediator? Well, we see that in John chapter 1, verse 14, as he moves through, right? And he talks about that, there was a man sent from God. His name was John, right? John came to bear witness for the light. John was not the light, right? But instead, John was telling people about the light. And then in John chapter 1, verse 14, we have this marvelous statement. And the Word became flesh and dwelt or tabernacled among us, and we have seen his glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. So if the marvel of marvels for Moses' life is that he, a sinful man, got to step into the presence of God, got to mediate between God and his covenant people, right? The marvel of Jesus, who has always been in the presence of God, who is God, who is divine himself, the marvel of Jesus isn't that he ascends to the mountain of God, but it is that he descends from heaven, and the eternal Logos, the one who at the beginning already existed, he takes on flesh. He is made flesh, right? The one who eternally is actually is born. He comes into existence as flesh, as one of us, right? He takes on bones and sinews and ligaments and joints, right? He becomes a man and he tabernacles. He becomes the greater tabernacle, the true tabernacle that was only a copy of the heavenly reality. He becomes the real tabernacle dwelling among us. And it's not, and the marvel of Moses was that Moses got to behold something, a fraction of God's glory, right? We see that in Exodus chapter 34. But Jesus, the marvel of Jesus is that Jesus shows us the glory of God. He's the true and better mediator, right? Because Moses gets the privilege of seeing some of God's glory, but Jesus radiates God's glory. Jesus is the image of God's glory to us, right? And notice that I think that this is all in Moses, in John's mind, right? That he does have these echoes of Exodus running through his mind, because notice what he says. So if we read from verse 16, right? For from his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. For the law was given through Moses. And again, that's a wonderful thing, right? That's a marvelous thing. That's a gracious thing that God gave his law through Moses. But what's the second half of that verse? Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. So something much more marvelous comes from Jesus, right? No one has ever seen God, the only God, who is at the Father's side. He has made him known, right? And so we have these interesting things all through Exodus of well, did Moses get to see God or but you can't see God, right? And here John comes into this and he says, no one has ever seen God. No one has ever really seen God, the only God, right? But the one who is at the Father's side, the one who is himself God, he's the one who makes him known to us, right? So he's the one who displays God for us to see, right? So as interesting as that question may have been, well, how much of God did Moses really get to see with his physical eyes? John is bringing us in and he's saying, yeah, no, Jesus is God made flesh. And he's the one who's radiating out to us the glory of God for us all to behold. He's the one that is making God known to us, so that Jesus will say later in John chapter 14, if you have seen me, you have seen the Father. Right? Isn't that marvelous? Now, of course, all of this, right? So all of these things of seeing that little phrase there in Exodus, right? This doesn't add anything new, right? So Hebrews makes this point very clearly, right? When it talks about Jesus being the greater Moses in Hebrews chapter 3, right? None of this is new doctrine. So the Hebrews chapter 3, says, therefore, holy brothers, you who share in a heavenly calling, consider Jesus, the apostle and high priest of our confession, who was faithful to him who appointed him. And here's where he brings in Moses. Just as Moses was faithful in all of God's house, Jesus has been counted worthy of more glory than Moses, as much more glory as the builder of the house has more honor than the house itself. So notice how he's comparing Jesus and Moses, right? Both are worthy of honor, right? Moses was faithful, Jesus was faithful, but Jesus is much more worthy of honor than Moses, just like the one who builds a house is worthy of more honor than the house he builds, right? And he says in verse 4, for every house is built by someone, but the builder of all things is God. So here he's equating Jesus with God. Now, Moses was faithful in all of God's house as a servant to testify to the things that were to be spoken later. But Christ is faithful over God's house as a son. And we are his house, if indeed we hold fast our confidence and our boasting in our hope, right? So, like, that idea is laid out explicitly there in Scripture, right? Moses was faithful as a servant. Jesus is faithful as a son, right? So what's the point of all of this? Well, I think that studying and seeing these sorts of things in the original languages, in the original text and in texts like the Septuagint, right? It just gives a richer flavor, a deeper contrast to what's going on, right? So again, was that in John's mind, right? I think, again, the Septuagint seemed to be widely enough used that I think that John, I think he had a decent familiarity with it. And Exodus would have been one of the most read books of the Old Testament, right? And so I think it's pretty likely, it seems to me, that John probably had those phrases, right? That thought process of Moses being the only one who gets to go proston theon, gets to be with God, gets to be in the presence of God in his mind as he's writing his gospel, and that may have indeed flavored how he wrote this down, right? To show that he's, even from the beginning, he's pointing to that distinction between that here we have the prophet who is like Moses, but who is greater than Moses, the one who gets to be a far greater mediator between God and his people because he is God. From the beginning has always been God, divine, and has now taken on flesh to dwell with us, to be one of us, to die for us, to live the perfect life of obedience, and to die the death that we were deserved to die. And so, I don't know. What do you think? I pray that is an interesting discussion. So there's much more that could be said of both the Exodus Septuagint, the Septuagint version of Exodus, and John's prologue. So I've been trying to read through that in more in the Greek and trying to understand that, and it is just a great well to dive down into. And so let me know what you think, if that discussion was helpful to you, or if it was not. Next week I'll probably go back to discussing a particular book, so I hope that follow-up to the Septuagint was helpful for you. And so thank you so much for listening. For more resources for knowing and loving God's Word, please visit bcnewton.co. And until next time, grace and peace.
Hola a todos.
Hola.
Estoy aquí con una niña. ¿Y cómo te llamas? Ay, hola, Gwendolyn. ¿Y tú estás aquí para hablar con nosotros sobre un libro otra vez?
Sí.
¿Cuál libro tienes?
Sí, Franklin.
Oh, un libro sobre Franklin. Ok. Y este libro se llama el pingüinito que tiene hipo.
Y la otra sí lo llevó.
¿Tiene hipo?
Sí.
Sí. ¿Por qué el pingüino tiene hipo?
Porque comió un tato picante.
Oh, ¿de verdad?
Sí.
Pero, ¿quién es Franklin?
La
Tú
otra.
dijiste que este es un libro de Franklin. ¿Quién es Franklin?
Franklin es la otra ballena.
¿Es la orca ballena?
Sí.
¿Y él comió el pingüino?
No, solo, no, él no comió el pingüino. Eso no estaba abriendo su boca y no comió al pingüino.
¿Él es el amigo del pingüino?
Sí.
Ay, qué bien, qué bien. Ok. ¿Y esto es uno de tus libros favoritos?
Ay, sí.
¿Es un libro muy chistoso?
Sí, no. Solo que tiene un tato picante.
Oh, tengo una pregunta. Bueno, ¿Cuántos juguetes de orcas tú tienes?
1, 2, 3. ¿Tengo 3?
¿Tres? ¿Solo tres?
Sí, yo lo 3.
Ok. ¿Tú quieres decir otro más?
Tengo que definir teta. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Muy bien. Gracias, Gwendolyn. Chao.
Chao.